Hello everybody and welcome back to the Northern Forge. Today I'm going to be forging a Bick, also sometimes referred to as a bickern or a Bick iron. This tool functions like a smaller version of the horn of the anvil, and I'm going to need it for an upcoming project, but I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the video. For now, we're just going to jump right in and get started. I'm going to be starting with a piece of 1¼ inch round bar from my scrap pile, and unfortunately, if I just square it up as it is, it'll fall right through my hardy hole, so I'm going to be starting out this project by upsetting the steel. Now, the process of upsetting the steel is just the opposite of drawing it out. You take a piece of steel and hammer on it on the end, and that will make it shorter and fatter instead of longer and thinner that you get with drawing out the steel. You can see here as I upset this billet, it is starting to bend over a little bit. As a general rule of thumb, you don't normally want to upset anything longer than about 4 times its thickness, but you can get away with longer when you're working on thick stock like this and being careful to straighten out the bends before it gets too bad. So you'll see me go back a couple times and straighten this out so that I can continue upsetting without folding it over and eventually causing cold shuts in the steel. And I'm going to jump over to the power hammer here to forge back down those ends as they start to flare out. The pickup tongs I'm using here are not ideal for this, but I didn't have any V-bit tongs that were quite big enough to hold on to the flared out ends of this, so we make do with what we've got. And now that I have the flares forged back down mostly, I'm going to use my biggest V-bit tongs. They're not a perfect fit, but good enough so I can forge one end down into the shank that will go into the hardy hole of the anvil. Once that's forged a little bit, I switch to a 1-inch V-bit tong to hold that shank, forge the other end so I can get rid of that flare, and then I'm ready to jump back over to the anvil. Now, back to the anvil, I work the steel with the shank in the hardy hole, and this will allow me to continue upsetting the top section without affecting the shank, and as the steel continues to get wider, it will spread and create a nice shoulder that will sit on top of the anvil and keep the bick from getting wedged down into the hardy hole when it's in use. As you can see, my blows are not perfectly straight up and down, so the bick does start to bend over a little bit. So I will rotate periodically as I go through this process just to keep it from bending over too far in any one direction, and in the end I'll be able to keep it nice and straight. I'll jump back over to the power hammer just to forge out the end, get those flares forged back in, and I can also straighten out the bend a little bit while I'm here. And now back over to the hardy hole. I'm getting really close to where I want that lower shoulder to be. So on this heat, I'm going to be taking some really aggressive angled blows to really drive that mass back into the middle and get it centered over top of the shank, so where I want it to be. And now I've got an adequate shoulder, so I'm jumping back over to the power hammer, and I'm going to take several heats on the power hammer as I draw out the top of this, and I'm going to draw that taper out into a nice long cone shape. And when I draw that down, it does create a bit of a fish mouth at the very end. So for this, I'm just going to go ahead and cut that piece off. Then I'll use the hand hammer just to finish out the taper on the end, as well as cleaning up any edges and taking out any high spots that might still be present from the power hammer. I wasn't quite happy with the length, so I'm going to go back over the power hammer and I'm just going to draw this out some more. Take a little bit of steel from that thicker shoulder section and make a longer bick on top. Now that I've got the length I want, back over to the anvil, and to do some hand hammering, I'm going to clean up the transition between the wider shoulder section and the actual cone, as well as cleaning up, again, the high spots that the power hammer leaves on the cone, and just finishing out the taper nicely. And the final step, I'm going to clamp the shank down in the vise, and then I can bend over the tip so that the bick, we want the end of it to be parallel to the ground, just like the horn of the anvil. So I'm just going to forge that over. Bending the end of the bick over did leave a little bit of a flat spot, so I come back over to the anvil, make sure that it's nice and parallel, and then do a little bit of cleanup. I want to round out that flat spot on top just to make sure that that doesn't transfer over into stuff that I'm going to use this to make. And we have to pause for a visit from the safety inspector. One more heat to finish rounding out the edges of that flat spot, and I'm going to leave this in the hardy hole to cool down, and it will be ready for use. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I've got an upcoming project that I need this tool for. You guys have seen me make a hidden tang chisel in a previous video. I want to try my hand at making a socketed chisel, and the horn of my anvil is just a little bit too big to really get a socket the size of what I want, so I'm going to be using this to do that. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked, please leave a like. Feel free to comment down below with what you'd like to see me make next, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one.